The gentlelady may use up. Let me point out here something. I have a poster board here. Now,
well, I thank my colleague from Texas for starting this special order tonight and giving me a chance to come down and be with you and spend some time talking about several different issues. I certainly agree with you that it is important for the American people to have faith and trust in their elected officials. And I think that there's a great deal of cynicism in this country, and people wonder what can they believe in. And I think that it is important that when they hear us speaking on the floor, or they get letters from us, or they have other means of communications from us, that they know that we are telling them the truth. When I first came here, we had folks speaking on the floor almost every night, and a group of us who were new in the Congress that year, in 2005, were so concerned about the things that were being said that we established a group called the Truth Squad. And we would come down at night after that group would speak and set the record straight by giving out what we thought were true statements. They were often very different from the statements that were being made by our colleagues. And I think it's important that we do this on every occasion, because frankly, I think in the last 3 years or so, the American people have really been sold a bill of goods. All of us would like to see things easier and better and less expensive, and we'd like to think that life would be a lot easier than it is. But we have challenges that we deal with every day, and it's not likely that the government is going to be able to make our lives easier for us, and yet that's what's been sold, I think, to the American people. And we haven't had the benefit of having a large segment of the media on our side in order to be able to counteract some of those things that were said. But I want to give a little detail, put a little meat on the bones of some of the things that you've been talking about in terms of what would this cap and tax plan do to us in the country. We have been told that everybody making less than $250,000 is not going to be taxed in this country. 95% of the people are going to get a tax cut. But let's talk a little bit again about the particulars of this. It's actually $250,000 per couple. It's not $250,000 for an individual. It doesn't exempt small businesses who often are taxed at the individual rate. So there's some minor little details in there in what's been told about taxes and about the budget that's been presented. And to go to your point about what the increase in taxes are going to do to the American people, you're absolutely right. Every single family is going to be paying for these ideas that are being brought up under the guise of scientific knowledge. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen any conclusive proof presented that the science can support this. And we know that President Obama himself said, under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. So we know that is going to happen. But the American people have not been explained how that's going to happen. There was a piece done by Fox News just a few days ago, I think March 4th, somewhere around March 4th, where an energy analyst, Margot Thorning, said in dollar cost terms, it's probably an additional $700 to $1,400 per family per year starting around 2012. That's right around the corner. So what the president says he's going to give is a tax cut, but that's going to amount to about $600 to $800. And at the same time, the families are going to be charged about $1,400 more in energy cost. So what the government's going to give, it's also going to take away. And I think, again, what you're doing is great. I have pointed out many times that the North Carolina state motto is to be rather than to seem. And I bring that up several times on the floor. I have brought it up several times on the floor because I think that's what the American people want out of us here in Congress. They don't want us to seem rather than to be, and yet what's being done here in the name of science, in the name of protecting us from the climate change that they believe is occurring, is going to be a pretty expensive trial as to whether or not this is going to work. And we don't know. It's an experiment, really. It's not proven science. We don't know that we're causing global warming with carbon. We've had global warming, global cooling, even before human beings were on the earth. So I think it's a great thing that you're doing to tie programs, policies, budgets, proposals to this issue of ethics, because they are tied together. They are very important. And I want to commend you for doing that. And I know that we've been joined by some of our very articulate colleagues here tonight, and I want to give them an opportunity to share their knowledge, their enthusiasm for this issue. And so I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Reclaiming my time, let me point out here something. I have a poster board here. Now, some might think I've been picking on Chairman Rangel too much, and I don't intend to do that. But this is to make my point. Chairman Rangel is in charge of taxation. That's his job. He's the tax man of this House. Now, Chairman Rangel, we have a little quote here from a real conservative news source that we all love and adore, New York Times, January 3rd, 2009. Rangel pushed for donation, insurer pushed for a tax cut. It's written by David Koshinsky. It says, on April 21st, 2008, Representative Charles B. Rangel met with officials of the American International Group, now troubled insurance giant, to ask for a donation to a school of public service that City College of New York it was building in his honor, and I'll point out named after him. Mr. Rangel had already helped secure a $5 million pledge to the project from a foundation controlled by Maurice R. Greenberg, one of the company's largest shareholders and its former chief executive. And CCNY officials, according to the school's own records, had high hopes that AIG would give a donation of perhaps as much as $10 million. Some may have heard of AIG. It's been a little bit in the news lately. Now, my point is, that is an accusation made by the New York Times, not by me, not by any member of this House. That's an accusation made by the New York Times that should be resolved, because it's from our number one tax man. And our number one tax man, along with the President of the United States, is going to be championing the Democrats' budget of $3.6 trillion, a number that almost defies imagination. We've gotten used to trillions in the last 60 days because we've seen lots of them. They're everywhere. This administration is throwing trillions around, you know, like tennis balls at Wimbledon. And we're sitting here looking at a new little slight glitch of $3.6 trillion. I would think the average American looking at this budget would like to know that the people that designed it and the people that put it together shoot straight, deal ethically with issues. And so they would like to know that, but they have an accusation from the New York Times that says contrary to that. So is there a place to resolve that? Yes, we have one. It's called the Ethics Committee. But there's no action out of the Ethics Committee. It just kind of sits there. So I guess our famous wrangle rule, which now is on everybody's tongue about special privileges for Mr. Wrangle, I guess we add this to the wrangle rule. I don't know what else to do with it, that if you have accusations and the Ethics Committee doesn't act, then it's they just go away. Trust me, everything's okay because the Ethics Committee hasn't acted. Well, I think they should. I'll start Beauty over the Beast. I have both Michelle Bachmann and Lynn Westmoreland, and I think we can all guess who the beauty is, Lynn. So I'll turn to Michelle Bachmann and yield such time as she would like to consume to talk about the budget and trusting those who are going to be giving us these numbers and these ideas. And shouldn't we have their ethical issues resolved as they lead this Congress down a $3.6 trillion path?
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Texas, Judge Carter, for yielding on that point. You could not have set up this segment better to talk about ethics, to talk about those who are writing our budget, that they need to live under the very laws that they're creating. You just quoted from the New York Times article that said that there were high hopes for AIG. The American people had very high hopes for AIG, the largest insurance company in the world. They should, after all. The American people own AIG now. We own 80% of AIG. The American people have been forced to invest $173 billion in this company. And they just found out that $165 million, perhaps as much as $450 million, has been paid out in bonuses to some of the executives at AIG. And the American people are outraged. They realize that's their money, and that money's going out on bonuses. But then along came a story earlier today from CNN. And CNN said, guess what? In President Obama's stimulus package earlier this year, we all remember, that's the over $1 trillion bill that none of us were allowed to read because the Obama administration wouldn't release that bill until after midnight, and we started debate the next morning at 9 o'clock in the morning. Contained in that stimulus bill is a very interesting provision that was put in by the head of the Banking Committee on the Senate side, Senator Chris Dodd. Senator Chris Dodd inserted a provision into the stimulus bill that said essentially this. It said that the bonuses that would be given out to any of these companies can stay with the people who get the bonuses unless they're given after February 11th of 2009. In other words, these bonuses that AIG received are prohibited by the language in the stimulus bill from being recouped by the U.S. government. We are prohibited. Our hands are tied. This is President Obama's stimulus bill, and the chair, the Democrat chair of the Banking Committee, inserted an amendment that said that prevented the taxpayer from recouping any bonuses that would be paid out to these executives. Now, this is a curious thing, because CNN also reported that the largest beneficiary of campaign donations in 2008 from AIG was Senator Chris Dodd. So Senator Chris Dodd, CNN said, the largest recipient at over $103,000, managed to slip into President Obama's stimulus bill, which he didn't give time for any member of Congress to read, a provision that would have prevented the American people from recouping any of these bonuses. Now, I think that raises questions, I would suggest, along the line of the gentleman that you've been raising about the ethical requirements of the people who are serving the American people. And with that, I'd yield back to the judge.
And I thank you for yielding back. And now I'll yield such time as he may consume to my good friend Lynn Westmoreland of the great state of Georgia.
Well, thank you, and I want to thank my friend from Texas for yielding. And, you know, Judge, I think what we have to look at is connecting the dots. You know, we see in a lot of these children's puzzle books and stuff, you connect the dots to see the big picture. And so, you know, I think if we could see the picture of all these dots connected, it would be hypocrisy that has come down from the Democratic leadership. And we could go back to even when they first became the majority in January of 2007, because prior to that, they talked about that they had a way of lowering gas prices. And Judge, you'll remember, gas prices went to almost $4 a gallon, over $4 a gallon in some areas. They never told us how they were going to get that down. The only way that that came down was for what we did in August of that year and really exposed the energy situation for what it was. And I think the speculators finally realized that we were serious about doing something for our own energy policy. Then if you look at the problems that Mr. Rangel has had, and, just to list a few, the loan subsidized apartments that he has, the fact that he was using letterhead to solicit some of these campaign contributions, the fact that he received the money from AIG and the other people that received some of this bailout, the fact that he didn't pay his taxes. And if you look at that, that's not anything in itself, but if you connect the dots with all the other things that are going on, I think it shows a picture of that they did what it took to get elected. And we can look at that with what President Obama's campaign promise was, that he would drive the lobbyists out of the White House. And now he's writing waivers. It seems like every time he does an appointment, he has to write a waiver because they're lobbyists. And so, we've got Mr. Geithner, who was approved by the Senate as the Treasury Secretary, who has similar tax problems. So, you connect all the dots, and what seems to be happening is that we see a chain of events that may seem separate, but they're really kind of all tied together. And then if you look at what President Obama's Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, said, and I can't remember the exact words, Judge, you may remember it, he said, but never let a crisis pass without taking advantage of it. And so if you look at this financial crisis and what has happened and what's taken place, look at how they're taking advantage of it with this $3.6 trillion budget that they're proposing, with the cap and trade, which is another tax that's going to be on the 95% that he promised would never have a tax. And if you look at the bonuses for AIG, well, the reason that they're getting the bonuses is because the government intervened into that business. If the government had not intervened and saved AIG, I don't know what kind of financial calamity would have been out there.
That's right.
But I promise you, these guys wouldn't have got a bonus.
That's right. That's right. That's
and
right.
so we enabled them to do that. So now what's the government going to do? Everybody's in an uproar over these bonuses being paid by these executives. As well they should. But now is the government going to say, we've got a crisis, we need to step in and intervene between contracts, between employers and employees? And so this is another one of those crises that's getting all this hype for the government to take one more step into our lives and into our businesses. And so this is a connect-the-dot picture that we've got to keep in mind. This is a lot bigger than what we ever anticipated or that the American people would think that they were getting. But, Mr. Daschle was another one. Ron Kirk. We could go on, Ms. Waters, others. And Judge, has the Ethics Committee met? Because if I remember correctly, back in November, Speaker Pelosi said that she was going to have this Rangel problem resolved by the end of December of 2008. I guess she did that for the elections, but it's not resolved yet, and I have not even heard of them having a hearing.
I haven't
and with
heard a
that,
peep out
I'll
of
yield
them.
back to the gentleman from Texas.
I haven't heard a peep out of them, and just recently, we have another story that has come out from the Congressional Quarterly. Waters calls TARP meeting for husband's bank. This is by Roth, part of the CQ staff. That's a magazine that's read a lot in this part of the country. Watchdog groups claimed Waters took inappropriate actions on behalf of One United Bank, which received financial assistance from the federal government last fall. Waters, a senior member of the Financial Services Committee, which oversees banking issues, last year requested a meeting between Treasury Department officials and representatives of minority-owned banks, including One United, on whose board her husband, Sidney Williams, had previously served. He also held stock in the bank. That's not our accusation. That's an accusation by a publication that is read regularly on the floor and in the halls of Congress. It informs us of what's going on. That's an issue that should be addressed by the body that's required to address it, the Ethics Committee. Is that unethical behavior? Possibly not. Possibly it is. But she's the chairman of the subcommittee on housing and community opportunity, which means if whatever housing there may be in the Obama bill, this $3.6 trillion Obama bill, and Lord, for that much money, there ought to be a couple of houses in there anyway, then if that's the case, she would be the spokesman for the housing attitudes of the U.S. government, of the majority party, the Democratic Party, who run this place, by the way. If nobody gets it yet, the majority rules in the House of Representatives. So when you have 38 more votes than the other guys, you win, they lose. That's the way it works. If you got one more vote and everybody stays with you, you win, they lose. So they own all this, okay? This Bush bashing that we hear around here, wake up. The man's hanging out in Crawford, chasing cattle. He's not doing this job anymore, and this is your job, the Democratic Party's job. They're doing this job here with the leadership of Barack Obama, their president. He, with their help, proposed $3.6 trillion. And when it comes to housing, we must rely upon Maxine Waters, the leader of that subcommittee. That issue ought to be resolved. I think that's important. This is the whole point of this whole thing. You know, this banking thing is, we're all worried to death about that banking thing. And I don't think any member of Congress, or for that matter, any American, isn't concerned about this tightening, choking down of credit that has taken place in the United States. And therefore, the entrepreneurial spirit of America is being choked down because of stupid mistakes that were made by the government. And let's maybe talk about those just a little bit. And I'll first yield to Michelle Bachmann.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm wondering when it will be that Congress will finally have hearings on itself and on the culpability of members of Congress for this housing meltdown. We look at individuals who are involved in shielding Freddie and Fannie for years from any sort of tightening, any sort of regulatory burden, any sort of accountability, any sort of transparency for years. We look at comments that were made even by the current head of the Financial Services Committee. I sit on Financial Services Committee, and the chairman of our committee, Barney Frank, had made statements when he was confronted by former Treasury Secretary John Snow that Freddie and Fannie were in deep trouble. And he also foretold of a housing collapse that he was pretending on into the future for the United States. And the comments from Representative Frank were, don't worry, everything's fine. There's no problem with Freddie and Fannie. People knew we were looking at a meltdown. When are we going to have those hearings? When are we going to hear from members of Congress their culpability in bringing about this housing meltdown? About the members of Congress who loosened and relaxed the platinum level standards of lending in our country. We had platinum levels of standards of lending for over 200 years in our country. Those lending standards were so reduced that created our subprime mortgage mess. It even created a problem in prime mortgages because the lending standards were so reduced. That just didn't happen in the free market because private businesses, they want to limit their risk. It was the federal government that forced these private businesses to maximize risk. With what? The promise that good old Uncle Sam, the chump called Joe Taxpayer, would bail these private businesses out, AIG, Freddie, Fannie, if anything went wrong. We need to have a hearing where members of Congress are called on the carpet for their involvement in leading to this housing collapse. I yield back.
And just another little news story here that broke. Now, this is a former colleague of ours. He's now, and maybe in one of the most powerful positions in the United States. He's the Chief of Staff of the White House, Rahm Emanuel. This is from the ABC News, a very conservative source. Emanuel was director of Freddie Mac during the scandal. 25,000 Freddie to Emanuel equals 200 billion taxpayers to Freddie. Written by Brian Ross and Rhonda Schwartz. President-elect Barack Obama's newly appointed Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, served on the board of directors of the federal mortgage firm Freddie Mac at a time when scandal was brewing at the troubled agency, and the board failed to spot red flags, according to government reports reviewed by ABC.com. The action by Freddie Mac are cited by some economists as the beginning of the country's economic meltdown. The federal government this year was forced to take over Freddie Mac and a sister federal mortgage agency, Fannie Mae, pledging at least $200 billion in public funds. And that's not my news story. That's ABC's news story. And, of course, our ethics committee, bless their hearts, I don't think they have to deal with Mr. Rahm Emanuel. I think maybe the White House has to deal with the issues of Mr. Rahm Emanuel. And maybe they should. But it's the White House budget that we're talking about. And he is the chief policy officer of the White House, so I would assume that Mr. Rahm Emanuel's fingerprints are all over this budget. And I would expect Mr. Rahm Emanuel to be a spokesman for this budget. And we all can watch in breathless anticipation and see if I'm telling the truth. But let's watch and see. But those sort of things ought to be cleared up with the American people, because at least one news source is saying this was the start of the crisis we're in. And he was right in the middle of it. So those are the kind of things we got to look at. Mr. Scalise has joined us. I'll yield such time as you'd like to have to comment on what we're talking about here today.
Well, I want to thank my friend from Texas for hosting this and really helping unravel the messes. As Americans all across the country are very frustrated. They're angry about what's happening with our economy. They're angry when they read about what happened with AIG. And then I think they get cynical when they see some of the very people who helped create this mess going on all of these talk shows over the weekend, pointing their fingers everywhere else other than themselves and saying it was this administration or that administration. And you could find more than enough blame to go around. But if you really go back to the root, and I think you've started to touch on it, the problems that existed with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, going back to the Community Reinvestment Act, going back to the 1990s when a gentleman who represented part of my state from Louisiana, Richard Baker, from Baton Rouge, who actually sat on the Financial Services Committee, he had the guts to go and take on Fannie and Freddie back in the 1990s. And he exposed all of this. And this is all out there on the internet. It's information you can actually go and verify. And you can look at those hearings, and many Americans already have. And for those who haven't, it would be a really good history lesson to go back and look at those hearings that he had as he was calling on the government to finally reform these institutions, who were being encouraged not by some bank on Wall Street, not by George W. Bush. This goes back to the Clinton administration, but it was people in Congress, some people who are right now chairman of these very committees that have oversight, and he was fighting and saying, we've got to reform Fannie and Freddie because this entire situation is going to melt down. We've got institutions that are encouraging people, using the strength of the federal government, encouraging people to go give out loans to people who don't have the ability to pay. And they were given edicts. Members of Congress who are in leadership positions today were given edicts to Fannie and Freddie saying, go out and give those loans to people who don't have any ability to pay. When people all across our country, people in my district, your district, people who are playing by the rules today, go out and want to get a home mortgage, they have to prove their ability to pay. They have to prove that they've got equity. They've got to put up maybe 20%. They've got to fill out a whole bunch of forms, and ultimately they make their payments. Over 90% of the people in this country, even in these tough economic times today, are making their payments on their mortgage. Yet you have a small group of people, some who actually lied on their application, but some who were encouraged by the federal government to get loans that they didn't have the ability to pay by these institutions, Fannie and Freddie. And people like Richard Baker back in the 1990s was saying, we've got to reform this corrupt system. And yet some of the very people who are now yelling at the top of the lungs at the top of this Capitol, saying blame this guy and blame that guy, they were there defending Fannie and Freddie. And it's all out there on the internet. You can actually go and see it. And yet when you look at what happened with AIG just 2 weeks ago, and of course, again, you've got the record to go and check it. The President Obama's spokesperson, was asked about the next $30 billion that the federal government released to AIG. And they said, what do you think about the money that AIG has already gotten so far, the $150 billion they had already gotten? They said, do you think that that money has been spent properly? And the White House actually said yes. They said, yes, we think AIG has done good things with the money. Now, clearly, AIG has not. And AIG's been caught giving bonuses, hundreds of millions of dollars, up to $6.5 million for some executives, in bonuses with taxpayer money. And then some of those very same people are yelling and screaming at the top of their lungs, and we're all outraged. But Americans that are outraged are looking at this, and they're getting very cynical because they're saying, wait a minute. We can actually go back and unravel this. We can look and see some of these same people, and those of us who voted against the financial bailout last year because we knew this was the wrong approach. We know giving taxpayer money to help these financial groups on Wall Street who made irresponsible decisions. We knew that was bad public policy. But yet some of those very same people who voted to give the money are now yelling about how the money's being spent even though they allowed the money to be spent that way. It was a wrong approach then. We should have never done it. We're seeing how flawed that system is now. But I think people across the country, they do get it. They're seeing what's happening out there, and they're realizing that some of these very same people that are yelling at the top of their lungs and expressing outrage were the ones who actually voted to give that taxpayer money away.
Reclaiming my time, you mentioned Wall Street. And Wall Street's taken a big hickey here lately. And you know who really took the hickey was the American people. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think everybody dreads doing almost as much as taking out the garbage is looking at their 401k or their pension plan after this last 60 days of the Obama administration and this trillion-dollar leadership of this Democrat-led House of Representatives.
Now, can I interrupt the gentleman?
It's not the
last 60 days. This is his first 60 days.
His first 60 days. Yes. Thank you for correcting me. And then, lo and behold, under the president's budget, taxes on capital gains and dividends would increase from 15 to 20%, increasing the taxes on investments by $338 billion over 10 years. So if the poor old guys whose 401k is almost used to wrap the garbage in, if he starts to have any kind of rally on the stock market at any time in the foreseeable future, at least the next 10 years, this budget we're being asked to pass, this $3.6 trillion budget, is going to raise the taxes on his poor little old beat-up 401k or on your pension plans. This is a direct tax on American families, and believe me, contrary to popular belief by the other side of the aisle, there's a lot of people in this country who make a whole lot less than $250,000 a year who own stock in corporations in America because they believe in the free enterprise system and they have invested in a way they feel is adequate to be good for their families. They will be hit by this capital gains tax. I'll yield to Mr. Westmoreland.
And thank my friend from Texas, but I was going to bring up, you were talking about the Wall Street, the large banks that got the bulk of this TARP money. our local community banks and some of the smaller banks did not get this. And the whole reason that this Congress, and I didn't vote for it, but I think a reason that the people that did were sold a bill of goods by then Secretary Paulson, that this was going to unfreeze the credit market, but it has not done that. And what has happened to the FDIC, and I'm not sure if the gentleman's heard this yet, but I had some of my local bankers call me, going from 100,000 to 250,000. Their premiums are going up. That's the way the FDIC is funded, is through premiums on this deposit guarantee. And so they are going up on the premium. And so now they're not only having to pay a higher premium on 100,000, but the higher premium on 250,000. But here's the kicker. They're going to be charged a one-time fee to from the FDIC on their deposits, I think it is, or their assets. To my friend from Texas, I was told today by somebody in our Georgia banking community that if you took of all the profits of all the banks in Georgia and added it together, the fees that these banks were going to be charged would be more than the money that they made all last year. Now, that is a double whammy on the small community banks that have been basically responsible for funding our small businesses in our communities that have not had access to this TARP money. And so what has happened is the big banks and the FDIC and the others who have let this situation get way out of hand are here again sticking their money down and getting the investors and the shareholders from these local banks their money. And these banks are owned by local people. I know we're getting short on time, so I'll let my good friend. But I want to thank you for doing this. And I think we need to remember that we need to continue not only with some of these ethics that you brought up, but we need to connect all these dots and get a clear picture of where this new administration and this larger majority is trying to take this country.
Well, I agree, and reclaiming my time, I thank Mr. Westmoreland for pointing that out. And actually, I have talked to my community banks too, and they're very concerned about the massive increase in their assessment by FDIC and the fact they're going to have to pay a premium. But also, what's really sad is they're the guys who made good loans. See, what people don't realize is that these community banks can hold their heads up high. They're not asking for TARP money because they didn't make bad loans. They stuck to the banking principles that their boards of directors made, and they stayed away from the pressure with some exceptions. But in the vast majority of the cases across this country, the community bank system made sound, good business decisions. And now, unfortunately, because of the way it works, they're going to have to pay the penalty for those people who went off and made bad loans. Now, we understand, and I think our bankers will tell you, they understand that's how the FDIC works, and it's a program that they rely upon. But it still is part of that old taint fair system that you and I have been talking about for the last couple of days. I want to bring up just one more thing that's in this budget that I think is going to be a real issue for some awfully important people in this country. This budget that they've got out here caps the value of itemized deductions at 28% for those who have income over $250,000 married or $200,000 single, which will reduce charitable giving in this country by $9 billion. You know, I don't know why in the world you would want to hit the charities, you know, the Cancer Society, the Heart Fund, the First Methodist Church or the Third Baptist Church, why you would want to hit those people's pocketbooks to fund $3.6 trillion. But to me, that's questionable. And we ought to be questioning that, and we ought to be saying, why in the world do we have to basically put a burden on charities, and then tomorrow, we're supposed to vote on a bill to pay volunteers with taxpayer dollars. So we're going to pay volunteers with taxpayer dollars rather than encourage private sector donors to take care of community problems that they all work hard to take care of. This is nuts. This is the European socialism at its best. Americans have hearts of gold. One of the things that the American people liked that Ronald Reagan said about them was he reminded them that deep down inside every American there burned that flame of liberty and freedom that made them good people who were all heroes because they got up in the morning and they went to work and they took care of their families. And yet, it seems that whoever put together this budget doesn't view America that way. They view it differently. Finally, something that I have been appalled with since forever is taxing death. You know, a guy works all of his life, he pays his taxes, he takes care of his bills, he works double shifts and works hard. He acquires some property, and that property gains value, whatever the property may be. And he's happy because he's been an honest, tax-paying citizen. And then he dies, and lo and behold, the United States government wants to come in and tax him on his death. Now, I have a good friend. I'm not going to use his name because I don't have his permission to use it, but he is from Clayton, New Mexico, and he'll know who he is, who had a beautiful ranching operation in Clayton, New Mexico when I knew him at Texas Tech University, and he was a buddy of mine. And he had two really nice ranches in that area, the home place and another ranch. I ran into him in Rock Springs, Texas a while back, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said, well, I'm living in Texas now. I'm ranching in Texas. I said, what happened to Clayton, New Mexico? He said, oh, the tax man took it. He said, when my dad died, I had to sell land, and the only land I could sell was the home place, which was the best place. So that only left me with our worst little ranch. I traded that for a small place down here in Texas, and I'm down here scratching out a living on about a third of what my daddy worked and fought for, and my great-granddaddy and my granddaddy died for in fighting to tame that part of New Mexico. I don't know. I find that's pretty offensive to me. Why does the United States government deserve to put that family of the fourth generation of that family out of the ranching business so they can tax a guy that's already paid his taxes? But that's headed our way in this new $3.6 trillion budget. I'm not going to go in tonight to the rest of the examples that I have here. We'll go into those another time. But my purpose, I hope I've made it clear, my purpose to get up and talk about these ethical problems is not to make the kind of accusations that were made in the last two Congresses ago against the Republican Party about culture of corruption, because I don't think that's appropriate. I'm only pointing out there are issues that have been raised by the watchdogs of this Congress, the press. They should be resolved.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your patience, and I thank you for this evening.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2009, the Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 60 minutes.